Well, there's anger in the Pacific region towards Australia for decades of undermining Pacific efforts to act on climate change. That's according to a new report out from a group called Fossil Free Pacific, a coalition of climate advocates and artists from the Pacific. That report accuses Australia of hypocrisy, quoting leaders like the Tuvaluan climate change minister, who says Australia champions climate action while expanding fossil fuel production. Fossil Free Pacific, Joseph Moeono-Kolio, has just returned from the UN Climate Summit in Brazil. He says Pacific leaders can't call out Australia properly because Australia is such a large aid donor. They're worried that Australia might, quote, turn the lights off.
Climate change is the number one economic and security threat to the Pacific, including Australia. The Pacific has been at the forefront of global climate leadership for decades. It's what delivered the 1.5 goal, loss and damage finance, most recently the ICJ advisory opinion, and now the global campaign for a fossil fuel treaty. So these achievements have raised global ambition, but while at the same time that's happening, the obstructionism from Australia is entrenched and bipartisan. As long as the Pacific has led the global fight against climate change, Australia has always been the one that undermined our efforts. We see that in the report. That's something that Australia has been doing for the last 30 years. So we wanted to kind of really uncover that as we move towards this strange marriage of an Australian Pacific COP, which now is going to be in Turkey. So
I'll get to the hosting of COP31 in a moment, but I want to ask you more about undermining. What examples do you have of Australia undermining climate efforts in the Pacific region?
Sure. So a most recently example of the ICJ advisory opinion, whereas the majority of Pacific governments were saying that we need greater strengthening of our climate laws, that the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement was legally binding. Countries like Australia were saying that the entire corpus of international law is not relevant to this, and it was only the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement. And you see that kind of undermining from Australia layered throughout our histories. And then in September as well, we saw most recently the governments of Vanuatu and Tuvalu try to get increased regional support for the call for a fossil fuel treaty. And I was actually in those rooms where Australia was trying to water that down. And then that's not even mentioning the COPs, where it's always Australia that's the difficult one of the group. It's always Australia that's saying one thing about the Pacific being family, and all the while continuing to export huge amounts of coal, which makes Australia the second largest contributor to emissions in the world. So it's this kind of duplicity that we've seen and that you see Pacific leaders constantly having to deal with.
Indeed, your report quotes Pacific elders' voice saying that Australia's hypocrisy in this area is particularly obvious. This report also claims that Australia uses its aid program to secure goodwill and prevent criticisms of Australia's climate policy. Can you unpack that for me? What evidence do you have for that?
Well, Pacific leaders have a responsibility to their governments and to their countries first and foremost. So it's always this delicate balance of how much do you call out Australia, but then also how much do you pull back in case they turn the light off, sort of thing. So it's that kind of having to navigate that sensitive diplomatic space with Australia all the time, unknowing that Australia is contributing to the worsening crisis, but also understanding the fact that they are the largest donor to the region. And so several former leaders have already come out and said that once they've left office or once they've moved on to other elements, this is understood amongst leadership in the Pacific that one has to be careful how they speak about Australia. A recent example was the approval of the Woodside gas project to 2070. Traditionally, Pacific leaders would come out swinging on something like that, but we noticed there was a lot more restraint being shown by leaders because of that tension.
Tell me about the hosting of COP31, which we now know will be performed by Turkiye. Australia ceded its co-hosting bid with the Pacific about 24 hours ago, saying instead there will be a pre-COP meeting in the Pacific, and also Australian Climate Change Minister Chris Bowen will hold the presidency of COP next year in Turkiye. Is that sufficient to make sure that Pacific climate concerns remain on the table?
The compromise, it's not ideal, and hosting in Australia would have been better. But at the very least, there is a silver lining, and that is having a pre-COP in the Pacific region and having an Australian presidency of the COP with heavy Pacific involvement still keeps the Pacific at the centre of COP31.
The climate wars in Australia, as they're known, have claimed the careers of many a political leader. Most recently, the federal opposition coalition has dumped its commitment to net zero emissions by the year 2050. What did you think when you saw that news?
The climate wars in Australia fascinate us to an extent that something so serious and something that is our daily lived reality could be treated as a novelty in Australia. But for us, the issue is that whoever is in government has always been weak on climate, whether it's the coalition or Labor. The coalition is upfront about its denialism, so at least we know where they stand. Labor, for all the platitudes, we don't know where they are, where they stand sometimes. But whoever it is, these climate wars are in a sense ridiculous, and we don't really pay them any mind because these are discussed by people who don't know what acidification of the ocean is, or don't know what it's like to come home to your crops and they're dead because of the salt water intrusion. These are folks who talk about climate change as if it's some political football or some ideological game and never have to worry about their houses being blown over or graves getting submerged into the sea. So in the one sense, they are fascinating. In the other sense, they're just childish. And we in the Pacific have very serious daily concerns when it comes to climate change. And hopefully the conversation in Australia will be a bit more grown up soon.
That's Joseph Moeono-Kolio from Fossil Free Pacific speaking to me earlier.